There's a question some families never say out loud at the funeral home. They nod along while the funeral director explains options. They sign the paperwork. They choose the urn, sometimes a simple one, sometimes one shaped like a dove or engraved with a verse. And later, maybe months later, maybe years, alone in a quiet room, the question finally surfaces. If there's nothing left of the body, does resurrection still happen for them? It's not a question people ask their pastor. It feels almost embarrassing to ask, like it reveals a lack of faith. So it gets buried right alongside the grief, never resolved, just carried. Maybe you've carried it. Maybe it's for a parent. Maybe a husband who wanted to be scattered over the lake where you fell in love. Maybe a sailor lost at sea whose body was never recovered at all. Not even ashes, nothing to bury, nothing to scatter, nothing to visit on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe it's a soldier whose family received a folded flag instead of a body. Maybe it's someone who died in a fire so complete that even dental records were the only proof of who they had been. Type this in the comments if you've ever wondered this and never asked anyone. I've wondered this too. Here's what I want to do today. Not rush to comfort you, not hand you a verse and move on. I want to actually walk through what Scripture says about a body that no longer exists in any recognizable form, because the answer is older than you think, and it comes from a man who asked almost this exact question thousands of years before cremation was even common, long before anyone had ever heard the word. And by the end, I think you'll understand why this question, the one you've been almost afraid to ask, has actually had an answer waiting in Scripture the entire time. Job lost everything, his children, all 10 of them, in a single afternoon. His wealth, gone in one report after another. His health, collapsing into something so visibly devastating that his own friends, sitting across from him, didn't recognize him at first. By the time we reach chapter 19, Job's body itself was failing him in real time, skin breaking down, bones aching with a pain he describes almost clinically, as if he's watching his own body fail from the outside. And his friends, instead of comforting him, were accusing him, insisting his suffering must be punishment for some hidden sin. It's in the middle of that collapse, not after recovery, not with hindsight, not with comfort, but right there in the wreckage, that Job says something almost shocking for a man in his position. He says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see God in my own flesh." Read that again slowly. After my skin has been destroyed. Job isn't picturing a peaceful burial with his body intact in some family tomb. He's picturing decay. To understand why this question carries so much weight, it helps to understand what ancient people believed about bodies and the afterlife, because it wasn't so different from what quietly worries people today. Many ancient cultures believed something had to remain, bones, ashes, some physical trace, for a person to be remembered, honored, or even to rest. Burial practices across the ancient Near East were elaborate specifically because people believed the body mattered, that how it was treated after death somehow connected to what happened after death. This is part of why being denied burial was considered one of the worst fates imaginable in the ancient world. Soldiers feared dying far from home, unburied, more than they feared death itself. Sailors feared the sea specifically because it swallowed bodies completely, leaving families with nothing, no grave to visit, no place to grieve, no proof that the person had ever truly been laid to rest. This fear wasn't irrational superstition. It came from a true instinct that bodies matter to God, that they were never meant to simply vanish into nothing and be forgotten. The mistake ancient people made wasn't believing bodies mattered. It was believing that the condition of those bodies after death determined whether God could still act on their behalf. That mistake is still alive today. It's just dressed differently. We don't fear unburied soldiers the same way anymore. We fear something quieter. A cremation urn, ashes scattered at sea, a fire too complete to leave anything behind. The fear is the same fear Job's world carried. Only the specific picture has changed. There's a verse in Revelation that almost nobody quotes outside of a very specific context. and it might be the most direct, most pointed answer to this exact fear that exists anywhere in Scripture. John describes the final judgment in Revelation 20, and right in the middle of that vision, he writes one short, almost startling sentence. The sea gave up the dead that were in it. Stop there for a second. Why would John even need to mention that detail? Why specifically call out the sea separately, as if it required its own special mention? Of every detail John could have included in his vision of the final resurrection of the dead, he chose to name, specifically, the one category of death that ancient people considered the most hopeless of all: those lost at sea, swallowed by water, with no grave, no tomb, no markers, nothing left behind for grieving families to ever return to. We already talked about how seriously the ancient world feared this. This was considered one of the cruelest fates imaginable. Sailors feared it more than ordinary death, because ordinary death at least left something behind: a body to wash, to wrap, to bury, to mourn over properly. Death at sea left nothing. Bodies were almost never recovered, sometimes not even bones washed up anywhere a family could find them. And John writes almost as if he already knows exactly what his readers are secretly afraid of, that even the sea, the one place ancient people believed swallowed people permanently, completely, without leaving a single trace, will give up what it took. Not eventually fade into vague spiritual symbolism. Give it up. Hand it back. This sentence wasn't written for sailors only, and it certainly wasn't written only for people in the 1st century. It was written for anyone in any generation who has ever quietly believed that the condition of a body determines whether God still has access to that person. John is telling you directly that the sea doesn't get the final word over anyone. Whatever holds your loved ones remains, right now. However completely, however finally it seems to have taken them, doesn't actually hold them at all. Not really. Not permanently. If that's landing somewhere tender in you right now, go ahead and write this in the comments. The sea does not have the final word. There's another passage that seems, at first glance, almost completely unrelated to this question. But stay with me, because once you see the connection, I don't think you'll be able to unsee it. Isaiah, writing centuries before Job's words would even be fully understood by later generations, turns to a discouraged, exiled people and asks them something almost confrontational. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Why would Isaiah bring up stars in the middle of comforting people who felt forgotten by God? Because Isaiah's entire point is about scale, about the sheer, almost incomprehensible reach of God's attention. He's reminding a people who felt abandoned that the God they serve names and numbers stars, not vague constellations, but entire suns, separated by distances we still can't fully comprehend even now, with modern telescopes that didn't exist for thousands of years after Isaiah wrote this. And God calls each one by name, one by one, without losing track of a single one. Here's the connection. If God's power and personal attention extend to keeping track of every single star, in every galaxy, individually, by name, then the question of whether he can identify and restore the scattered particles of a single human body, a body he personally formed in the first place, a body he knit together before that person ever took a single breath, isn't actually a difficult question for him to answer. It's not even a stretch. It's the exact same kind of power, the exact same kind of personal, particular attention, simply applied to something infinitely smaller and infinitely more personal than a star burning 100,000 light years away. Type this if this is starting to shift something in you. He knows every particle. Here's something worth sitting with for a long moment, because it quietly, almost completely, answers this entire question without anyone needing to argue theology about it at all. Genesis tells us God formed the very first human body from dust, not from something already living, not from something pre-existing and intact and merely waiting to be activated. Dust, the most scattered, formless, directionless material imaginable, the kind of material that blows away in the wind, that you can't even hold a shape within your hands, If God's original method of creating a human body was gathering dust off the ground and breathing life into it, then a body that has returned to dust, however that happened, hasn't actually presented God with some brand new problem he's never solved before. It has simply returned to exactly the kind of material he started with the very first time, in the very first garden, with the very first man. Cremation doesn't create some new category of person Scripture never anticipated or prepared for. Neither does drowning at sea, nor being lost in a fire too complete to leave remains, nor any other way a body might eventually be reduced to almost nothing at all. Every single human body that has ever existed, without exception, eventually returns to the basic elements it originally came from. Some slowly, over decades underground, some quickly through fire or water or violence. The timeline changes from person to person. The ultimate material it returns to does not change at all. And the God who spoke that first body into form out of nothing, but dust, has never once, not in the entire history of creation, needed an intact specimen to work with. He invented the entire process of making a living, breathing, image-bearing human being out of material that, to our eyes, looks like nothing useful at all. This brings us to one detail in 1 Corinthians 15. That's easy to read past if you're only scanning for an answer about appearance, rather than slowing down to understand the actual mechanics Paul describes for what happens to a body that has completely broken down. Paul compares the resurrected body to a seed, not a sleeping body, preserved somewhere intact and dormant. A seed, something that is, by its very design, meant to break down completely, entirely, before anything new can possibly emerge from it. He writes, "What is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable." The Greek word behind perishable there doesn't simply mean fragile or weak. It describes something that decays, that breaks down, that ceases to exist in its current recognizable form entirely. This is the part most people miss when they read this chapter quickly. Paul isn't describing resurrection as God carefully repairing whatever happens to be left over. He's describing something far more dramatic, an entirely new act of creation, using the exact same pattern he used the very first time, speaking life into what currently exists only as scattered, broken-down material. A buried seed doesn't somehow maintain its outward shape underground while it waits patiently to sprout. It dissolves completely first. That dissolving isn't a flaw or a tragic accident in the process. That dissolving is the process itself, the necessary first step towards something greater. This means cremation, far from creating some kind of unprecedented theological complication that Scripture never anticipated, actually fits perfectly within the pattern Paul already describes for every single human body, everywhere, regardless of how that body was buried, burned, lost at sea, or scattered across a hillside. Everybody that has ever lived eventually becomes unrecognizable in some way. Resurrection was therefore never, even once, going to be a matter of God locating intact remains somewhere and simply reanimating them like flipping a switch. It was always, from the very beginning, going to be the same creative power that spoke a body out of dust the first time, speaking it into being again. If there's an urn somewhere in your home right now, on a mantle, in a closet, scattered somewhere meaningful to you, a lake, a garden, a favorite hillside, I want you to understand clearly what you're actually looking at when your eyes land on it. You are not looking at the limit of what God can do. You are not looking at evidence that something irreversible has happened, that even God cannot undo. You are looking at material God has personally handled before, in every single human body that has ever lived and died, regardless of the specific method by which that body eventually broke down. Ash, bone, dust, seawater, soil, Scripture treats all of it the same way, without distinction, not as an obstacle standing in the way of resurrection, as the starting material he has always, every single time, used. Job said this after imagining his own skin completely destroyed, while he could feel that destruction happening in real time. John said this specifically about the one place the ancient world feared most as the location where bodies simply vanished forever. Isaiah said this about a God who personally names stars by the billions and somehow forgets none of them, ever. And Paul said this using the most universally understood image of total, complete decay available in his entire world, a seed, vanishing entirely before it becomes anything new at all. If you've buried someone or scattered someone or lost someone whose body was never fully whole again, through illness that wasted them down to almost nothing, through an accident that left little behind, through fire, through water, through any of the 1,000 ways a body can be taken from us in pieces rather than whole, you are not carrying a harder case than God has already handled. You are carrying the exact same case he has handled in every single resurrection he has ever promised, to every single person who has ever trusted him with what happens after their last breath. I want to slow down here for a moment because there's something easy to miss in all of this if we move too quickly toward the comfort and skip past the waiting itself. This promise hasn't happened yet. The trumpet John describes the moment Paul writes about, the day Job was so confident about even in the middle of his suffering. None of that has arrived yet for you or for the person whose remains you're caring for right now. You are living in the space between the promise and its fulfillment, and that space can feel very long, very quiet, and very uncertain some days. That's allowed. Scripture never asks grieving people to skip past their grief in order to access hope. Job himself spent chapters lamenting before he ever spoke those words of confidence in chapter 19. The hope didn't erase his suffering. It existed right alongside it, in the same breath, in the same sentence sometimes. So if you're still waiting, still grieving, still occasionally walking past that urn and feeling the weight of it all over again, that doesn't mean your faith is weak or that you've misunderstood something. It means you're human, living faithfully inside a promise that hasn't fully arrived yet. That's exactly where Job lived. That's exactly where the early church lived too, waiting for a return that, still 2,000 years later, hasn't come. If this brought you peace today, share it with someone still quietly carrying this question, afraid to ask it out loud the way you might have been before today. Maybe a friend who lost a spouse and chose cremation without ever telling anyone they wondered about this. Maybe a parent who lost a child and never recovered a body. Maybe someone you know who served in the military and lost someone whose remains never came home. The God who named the stars one by one. The God who formed the first body out of nothing but dust. The God who promised the sea itself would someday give back what it swallowed. That God has never once needed an intact body to keep a promise. He has never needed anything to work with except his own power. The same power he used at the very beginning. The same power Job trusted in the middle of his own body's collapse. The same power Paul described using the image of a seed dissolving completely in the ground before anything new could grow. That power hasn't diminished. It hasn't grown old or weaker with time. It is exactly as available to the body in that urn, or in that sea, or in those ashes, as it was to the very first body God ever formed from the dust of the ground. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Secrets of Heaven, because next time we're going to look at something else most Christians have never been told clearly. What Scripture actually says about the moment you see God's face for the very first time, and why that moment matters more than almost anything else we've talked about today.